Hey there, this is Curveball and I'm Kellie Riordan. I've got one of my producers here today, Grace Pashley, who helps put together Curveball. Hey, Grace.
Hi, Kellie.
I thought we should talk today about one of the things that keeps coming up in episode after episode, and that's this idea of vulnerability. When I look back at all of these episodes, whether it was the very first episode of Curveball where we heard from Paul Scurrah, who was the CEO of Virgin Australia when we had to ground all the flights during the pandemic, and how kind of vulnerable he felt as a leader at that moment, through to, you know, Olivia Humphrey from Canopy talking about, you know, how vulnerable she felt when she had to sell her company. And then this season, it's come up again and again. And I guess, you know, Brené Brown's the one who's come up with vulnerability, right? What do you think vulnerability actually is or means, Grace?
Well, I've been thinking about it a lot, obviously putting this season of Curveball together, but the thing that I get tripped up on is that vulnerability kind of changes depending on whether you are made vulnerable or whether you are choosing to be vulnerable. One is obviously better than the other, but I think people who are really able to make their vulnerability work for them have probably had those experiences maybe earlier in their life or in their kind of leadership careers, whatever it may be, where they have to kind of, I guess, defend themselves in some way, or maybe they're feeling like they've maybe been rejected, or there's something that's exposed to them and has made them vulnerable. And what you do in that situation can really define you from that point. So I think that that's really interesting when I think about guests that we've talked to, especially Michelle Bridges, who, you know, had all of this, a really tough upbringing, you know, and she talks about it, but she's really had to have kind of a guard and had to build her own walls up. And I think when you're in that position where you have these walls that you've created for yourself, it's kind of a self-protection mechanism, and you choose to bring them down, that is really, truly a vulnerable position to be in, because it's kind of new territory for someone like Michelle. And when you're really choosing to, I guess, expose yourself in that way.
So Michelle Bridges, of course, is the big fitness trainer. She was on The Biggest Loser, etc., and she's coming up in Curveball shortly. People haven't heard this episode yet, but what we found fascinating, as you said, this is a woman who's built her entire empire on being strong, courageous, brave. I can do it. And it's usually the person at the other side, the person being trained, the person wanting to lose weight, that's in the vulnerable position. But what we found super interesting about this interview was that 2020, and it was for many people, but for Michelle in particular, because she'd had some personal dramas, you know, some business problems, she found herself in a very vulnerable position for the first time.
There was a lot happening for me at a very personal level, and, you know, I just felt I need to reset, regroup. I need to protect my son. I need to protect myself, and I need to kind of somehow figure out what this new landscape is going to look like. So it was probably, if I'm honest, I would say that year was the most challenging year of my life, without question. And I learned a lot about vulnerability and how beautiful vulnerability can be, and how beautiful people can be, and humanity. You know, you look at social media and you look at, you know, negative comments or whatever, and you think people are mean, people are rotten. But I found it to be the opposite case. You know, I found a lot of people were very supportive of me and really reaching out, and I allowed my guard to come down, and it was pretty powerful.
How hard was that role reversal for you? Because you've always been the motivator. You're the cheer squad. So when you needed the cheer squad and the pep squad, you know, you leaned into that?
Yeah, definitely. It was everything. It was so good. And it was, you know, like I think about even my members of 12-week body transformation, like, you know, with 10 years worth at that point, 11 years worth of members, like they just rallied around and were so supportive and protective. And, you know, my close friends were incredible. And, you know, it's true what they say, when trauma hits or tragedy strikes, you soon work out who is there for you, who's got your back. And I know now that the close people that I have in my circle, they're rock solid.
I found that really fascinating. Do you think you're a vulnerable person in the workplace, Grace?
Kelly, I think I'm a vulnerable person in general. And it's not anything that, you know, I've lived a beautiful life. I don't think I've been exposed in any kind of dangerous ways. I don't have huge walls. And I think maybe that's why I seek out vulnerability. I think, and it's maybe an earnestness as well. I think you just get better connections with people, and your relationships are better, I find, if you are able to set out on kind of a vulnerable foot. Maybe not at the start, you know, you have to suss people out first. But I think in the workplace, especially in media and in the role that I play as a producer, I have to form quick connections with people. They have to trust me, and I have to really get to the heart of something quickly often. So, you know, I try to be open with them and show that, you know, I'm going to hold their story with care. And I think you get out what you give if you are vulnerable with people in a workplace setting.
Which is interesting because you've also been the leader of a radio station, and it's a community radio station where there's lots of competing interests and there's lots of people with different, there's almost factions like a political party. So how did you navigate, you know, getting things done, being a leader that could make firm decisions and stick to those, especially if they were controversial, but also seem like you were open and vulnerable and you acted like a human being, I guess?
I think it all comes back to trust and the way that you build trust with people when you're in a leadership position. I really just use admitting when I'm wrong as a way to be vulnerable with people that I'm working with, or, you know, at the community radio station volunteers, or even with the board, with my bosses. I would always be the first to say, my bad, we could have actually done it this way. And when not just using that as like a, you know, tool to establish a connection, it actually gets better outcomes. Because if you can say, I was actually wrong in that scenario, and actually I think you had a better idea and we should have tried it your way. Next time, let's do it that way. You can actually produce better work and get better things done. And I think that's a vulnerable position to put yourself in, especially, you know, I was quite young when I was in that role, and most people who I worked with were older than me and had a much longer association with the radio station. So, you know, I probably would have had a bit to gain by posturing a little bit and having a bit of a wall up and saying, no, I have this, I'm the boss and I know more than you, blah, blah, blah. But I think that's just, it's not really in my nature to do that. And I think it wouldn't have worked. So I think it's really just showing that, you know, even if you're the leader, it doesn't necessarily mean you have all the answers. And I think that's a position of vulnerability at work that I think more people should take. I think it's really, you know, just it leads to a more collaborative environment.
You know what I find really powerful and interesting about that, because I've been the boss of, you know, big teams, big creative teams. Creative people are, you know, often have a little bit of imposter syndrome or are self-conscious in some way. And I had a producer who worked for me who came on from another organisation, came into the ABC to work for me, and she spent the first couple of months just sort of trying to impress me. And it just was awful. The dynamic was horrible because the harder she tried, the worse it became, and the more I didn't like what she did, and it was awful. And then suddenly she just realised, or maybe I gave her a bit of permission that, like, you don't have anything to prove here. You know, I hired you because I believe in you. And then she did those things that you're talking about. She started to own up when she didn't know something, or she would fess up to a mistake. Yep, I completely got this wrong. I stuffed this up and I need your help with how to fix it. I would so much rather that as a boss for you to come to me and go, I'm struggling with this, or I haven't got this right, than what she was doing the first time, which was pretending she knew everything. And And I could tell that she didn't as well. So it's so powerful both as a boss and also as an employee, I think. In just a sec, we'll find out just how vulnerable I am as a leader. I'm Kellie Riordan and this is Curveball. My producer Grace Pashley is here today. We're talking about vulnerability. And of course, Grace, it's Brené Brown, the author and the social researcher who really has made, I guess, this vulnerability thing such a big deal. You know, she's got endless books and podcasts and TED Talks about it. She talks about vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and embracing emotional exposure. And you talked about that emotional exposure earlier, Grace, and it made me reflect on, you know, my journey as a leader, because I think I came to leadership relatively young, sort of in my late 20s when I was running a team of sort of 30 or 40 people. And I think then you do feel like you have to have the answers and you have to be a firm leader and all of those things. But I think as time went on, I learned that I didn't have to have all the answers, which is hugely powerful. But you were saying you're naturally vulnerable. See, I don't think I am. I'm a coper, but sort of to my detriment. Like, I'll always be the one going, no, I'm the one who doesn't fall apart. I don't cry. I just get on with it. I cope. I can sort of hit that push through button. And this push through button is something that Brené Brown talks about a little bit. She goes, it's so, you know, people hit the push through, like stuff is in crisis, everything's burning. What's your immediate reaction? My immediate reaction is hit the push through button, keep going. But that's backfired on me a few times where, you know, I've ended up burnt out or, you know, haven't managed my family life properly, no self-care, all of those things which are terrible. But I think I've learnt over time that it's okay to let people know that you're struggling. And also to go, I'm scared too. I can remember, you know, again, leading the team I was leading when the pandemic first happened and we're all having to leave the offices unexpectedly and everyone's worried about their family's health and their health and just the whole thing that we all went through. And I just remember I said to everyone, because I've actually evacuated an office in extreme circumstances once before because of a breast cancer cluster at the ABC, where we literally, I was managing a radio station, which by the very nature of it goes to air 24/7. So there's no like stopping. And we had to evacuate the site, but stay on the air with no notice. So to completely move an entire broadcast operation and not miss a beat. I've done that once before. So I was saying to everyone, look, I've actually done this before, but I'm scared as well. And I know you're scared. I'm scared. We're all scared, but we'll just keep looking after each other and we'll keep checking in. We'll just take it one day at a time. And I can also remember speaking to another leader at the time who's a school principal, and she's it's a very prestigious private school that she's the principal of, so people have an expectation that you know what you're doing all the time. And she said in the middle of that sort of go-home order that we all had, you know, and she was talking about it at the moment when do we go home, don't we? What's the health or so? It was sort of before there were proper rules in place. And so some staff were like, this is all just media hype and we don't need to do anything. And other staff are like, oh my God, the world's about to collapse and we all need to go home. And in front of her whole teaching staff, so, you know, in a school like that, that would be 100 teachers. She stood up in front of them and she burst into tears. And she just said, I just really feel that we all need to go home. I'm worried about your safety and I really care for you all. And she thought later that night, she thought, oh my God, I've just burst into tears in front of my 100 staff. But of course what happened is everyone went, oh, okay, we're allowed to feel the emotions that we feel. But also she's crying because she cares. She really kind of cares about us. And that's the other thing that I've learned is that when you show some vulnerability, you know, it shows people that you care and it actually lets other people care for you. Like one of the greatest gifts you can give someone is to allow them to help you. And This was really rammed home for me this year with a bit of a rough year, but I was talking about this very thing with Kath Koshal, who was on a previous episode of Curveball this season. And if you haven't listened to this episode, like it's incredible, isn't it, Grace?
It's amazing.
She's just the most resilient person. But this is her talking about using humour in these moments of vulnerability.
So if you're going through a struggle or an adversity, you've been through plenty, especially most recently, when we can laugh, and it doesn't have to be at the situation, like find whatever works for you, but when we can laugh, and I mean that like kind of belly laugh, like that produces the hormones and the chemicals that rush through your body, immediately that struggle or that adversity becomes a little bit more tangible. Like you can look into it with a bit more of a positive viewpoint because you've just laughed and had a bit of a lighter side of life. And so I think humour plays a huge role, especially in Australian culture, right? But in adversity, I think it's such a tool, like it's a tool that we can all use to tackle any kind of struggle that we might have or stress or whatever it is. Like, so if you haven't laughed today, go onto YouTube, tell someone a joke, get someone to tell you a joke, whatever it is, figure it out. So I think humour is an incredible tool for all of us to use in our toolbox of resilience and well-being as well.
It's so true. I was thinking, I broke my arm earlier this year. We were in the middle of, we had to move out of our house because it got flooded. And anyway, the day of the surgery, I'd fallen over on the hockey field, not playing for my state. Just playing club hockey. But I had to ring Rachel, my producer, who works at Dead Set Studios, because my husband had to meet some insurance people back at the house. So to get to the actual hospital to have my surgery, and I could have called other family members and whatever, but it just so happened that I called Rachel. So she turns up and she's like, oh, look at you. What a mess. Your arm's in a slab and in a sling and all the rest of it. And because I'd got ready by myself, I realised when I went to get in the car, I couldn't do my shoelaces up. So I've come downstairs with my shoelaces flopping all over the place. And the first thing I've said to her, she's taken one look at me looking like a sad sack. And I'm like, can you please do up my shoelaces? And we both just lost it because it was so funny. And she knows that I'm like you, I'm not very good at asking for help. And it lightened the whole day for me and the whole trip to the hospital, and, it just makes such a difference. It's so powerful, isn't it? That idea that once you let someone in a little bit, it really does pay dividends for both people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's the bridge between being made vulnerable and choosing to be vulnerable is when you've got that person there who, I guess, shows you the light, the way out of it, that there are people who care, and that even if you're made to be vulnerable, even when it might seem hard to see the people who are in your network, who are around you, usually one or two pop their heads out of the woodwork to really come through for you in the end. And then that's when you kind of realize, okay, the cost of vulnerability, I think I can bear that because I've got a few good people in my corner.
You also helped me produce the opening episode of this series, which was with former Olympian Jana Pittman. And she had this incredibly difficult moment where she had to go to her parents for help.
Yeah, she really, there are so many points in Jana Pittman's life and career where she has been exposed, and as a really young Olympian, really thrust into the spotlight in her late teens, and kind of just hitting that push-through button that you mentioned and that Brené Brown talks about through much of her 20s, and kind of getting to a point and realizing, what am I doing? None of this is what I want anymore.
So, yeah, I vividly remember looking at my account and thinking, oh, my God, I have $20 in the account, a mortgage due and food to pay. So it was really hard, and I cried a lot of tears, and I'm just very grateful that my parents were actually in a position to help me out. I'm pretty proud of them that they worked so hard in their life that they were able to step up and literally looked after us for that period of time.
Jana Pittman's story is a really powerful example of, your past not defining you, but finding that nugget of vulnerability that you experienced so long ago and allowing it to be a part of you and not trying to reject it, and really just letting that come through.
So if you haven't listened to that episode with Jana Pittman, there were so many great little nuggets. You can download it now. It's in the Curveball feed. Hey, Grace, thanks for being vulnerable today.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks for having me.
And you can listen to all of the episodes of Curveball if you just go back into your feed and hit download. And also, we'd love you to follow the show so it does make sure that you don't miss an episode. We also have a LinkedIn newsletter. So you can follow me, Kellie Riordan, on LinkedIn if you'd like more Curveball leadership goodness.